Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Welcome to the webinar on understanding the impact of synthetic identity theft, what every advocate should know, sponsored by Experian. My name is Linda Williams, and I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action and your host for the day. And on behalf of Consumer Action Executive Director Anna Flores and the entire staff at Consumer Action, welcome. I am so excited. I am pumped about the conversation that we are about to have on synthetic identity theft. Today, we're going to have a robust discussion about this hard to detect form of identity theft. But before we get into the presentation, I have a few questions for you. What the heck is synthetic identity theft? And how is it different from other forms of identity theft? Do you know? Are you aware of the impact this type of fraud can have on businesses, government agencies, and consumers? And how are these synthetic identities created? Tell me this. Why are our children the target of this type of identity theft? Generation Z has enough challenges to face already. But tell me this. What happens if you are a victim of this hard to detect form of identity theft? And oh my goodness, if the form of identity theft is so hard, how would victims learn that they are victims? Are there any laws to protect us against this synthetic identity theft? And what are the steps to take if you find out for some reason that you are a victim of the synthetic identity theft? If you join today's webinar because you're looking for answers to these questions and more, then strap in and listen up because we have four subject matter experts here to provide us with answers to these questions and more. Michael Bruemmer is here with us today. Listen up. Michael is the Vice President of Data Breach Resolution and Consumer Protections at Experian. Now, if you attended any of our webinars in the past, our trainer events in the past, then you're familiar with our next expert and you know how good she is. Eva Velasquez is here. She is the President and CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. Also joining us today from the FTC is Charles Harwood. Charles is the Northwest Regional Director for the FTC. So you're in for a real treat today. So take a last sip of that coffee, put down that teacup, and get ready to take a few notes. Buckle up and strap in tight because we are bringing the fire today. Now, let me go over a few housekeeping items so you will know what to expect. This is a 90-minute webinar. If you have any questions for our guest professional, put them in the chat box. At the end of all presentations, my coworker, Nelson Santiago, well, he's going to facilitate a question and answer segment. So this is where we get to hear from you. So keep the conversation moving with your questions. This webinar is being recorded and it will live in perpetuity on our YouTube channel. Now, you will receive a link to the recording and some great handouts by tomorrow afternoon, if not sooner. AFC professionals, you will also receive the password to claim your 1.5 CEUs tomorrow as well. Now, at the end of today's webinar, you will receive a survey regarding today's session. Please complete the survey and return it as soon as possible. In addition, as a bonus for attending today, well, you will receive a certificate of completion. Consumer Action is presenting this webinar with funding from Experian. So I wanted to take a minute and do a special shout out to Experian for believing in our mission and helping us to deliver this timely and much information to you today. Now, for those of you who are new to Consumer Action and are wondering, what do they do over there at Consumer Action? Well, we are an educational and advocacy organization. Through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policies that promote fairness, fairness for all consumers nationwide, but especially for those marginalized, underrepresented consumers nationwide. When you're on our homepage, you see that little burgundy link there in the middle? Click on that link and you will land on our COVID-19 educational project page. There you're going to find relevant, easy to use resources and tools for the communities that you serve. Now, let me review the roadmap with you quickly so you know where we're headed today. We open each and every training, regardless of whether it's virtual or in training, with a game. The title of the game is How Much Do You Know? So today we have 3 true or false questions questions about synthetic identity theft. After the game, I will introduce you to our speakers in the order that they will be presenting today. The question and answer segment led by Nelson Santiago will follow. I will come back, tell you how you can donate to consumer action, and wrap up. So this is how the game is played. There are three true or false questions. First, I will read the question. You will use the chat box to answer each question. Then, after giving you a couple of minutes, I will close the poll and take a look at the results. And I will tell you if the statement is true or false and why. And the person, listen to this, the person with the most correct answers, drum roll please, he or she will receive the bragging rights. So how much do you know? So let's roll out that first question. Synthetic identity theft's most common victims are, are active duty service members and veterans. Is that true or false? Synthetic identity theft's most common victims are active duty service members and veterans. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. 46% of you said that is a true statement. 54% think the statement is false. Well, 46%, you are incorrect. According to a 2022 article that's posted on Experian.com, children, the elderly, and incarcerated people are popular targets of these who steal Social Security numbers because these individuals are not commonly using their credit. So the most common victims are children, the elderly, and incarcerated people. You're doing good though. Let's move on to the next question. Question 2 is about the impact of synthetic identity theft on financial institutions. So question 2, synthetic identity theft cost financial institutions $20 billion in 2022. Is that true or false? 20 billion? Is that true or false? Synthetic identity theft cost financial institutions 20 billion in 2022. Okay. Let's close the poll. Take a look at the results. 82% think it's a true statement. Come on, 82%. 18% thinks the statement is false. So is it true or false? Actually, the statement is true. One study found that synthetic identity fraud cost financial institutions $20 billion in 2022, with the average thief stealing $81,000 to $97,000 before the scam was uncovered. Wow. Another report found that online lenders lose $6 billion a year to synthetic identity fraud, with the Federal Reserve Bank calling it the fastest growing financial crime. And a compliance officer at Notre Dame Financial Credit Union noted that his organization lost over 200,000 in unpaid loans before they suspected that something was fishy. So if you said true, you are absolutely correct. You're doing great. Let's move on to the last question. Okay, so question 3 is about how synthetic identities are established and used. So a synthetic ID can be created by thieves by exploiting the authorized user option for credit cards. Is that true or is that false? Exploiting the authorized user option for credit cards? Was that true or false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. Wow, 88% of the audience believe that is a true statement. Only 12% thinks it's a false statement. Actually, the statement is true. There are three main ways in which identity thieves exploit the credit process to establish synthetic identities and to execute fraud by applying for credit directly with a lender, by using the authorized user provision of most credit card accounts, and through data furnisher schemes. You're going to hear more about synthetic identity theft, its impact, and how synthetic identities are created through our presentations today. Thank you so much for playing the game. You are awesome audience. So let me move on and introduce you to our guest speaker. Our first speaker is Michael Bruemmer. As I stated earlier, Michael is the global head of Experian's Data Breach Resolution Group and vice president of Consumer Protection. The group is the leader in helping businesses prepare for a data breach and mitigate consumer risk following a breach incident. He has more than 25 years in the industry, and he brings a wealth of knowledge related to data breach preparedness and breach management, from discovery to post-incident cleanup. Michael has handled some of the nation's largest breaches over his tenure with Experian, and more than 25,000 to date. Michael has educated businesses of all sizes and sector through pre-breach and breach response planning and delivery, including notification processes to affected consumers, call center setups, and identity theft protection services. Michael, welcome to the webinar. Our next speaker is Charles Harwood. Charles Harwood has been the director of the Federal Trade Commission's Northwest Regional Office, located in Seattle, Washington, since 2014. He was also the Northwest Regional Director between 1989 and 2009. From 2009 through 2013, he was the Deputy Director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection. And during that period, he also briefly served as the Acting Director of the Bureau. Between 2008 and 2021, Charles was the Commissioner of the Department of Interior Indian Arts and Craft Board for 3 years. Before joining the FTC, he was a staff attorney for the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee from 1983 to 1989. Charles, welcome to the webinar. Eva Velasquez is our third speaker. She is the president and CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. Eva previously served as the vice president of operations for the San Diego Better Business Bureau and for 21 years at the San Diego District Attorney's Office. She is a recognized expert who has been featured on CBS Morning, NBC Nightly News, CNBC, The American Greed, Fortune, The New York Times, NRP, The Associated Press, to name only a few. Eva is the recipient of the National Crime Victims Award from the U.S. Department of Justice and the National Consumer League's Florence Kelly Consumer Award. Eva, welcome back. Audience, I know you are anxious to hear the presentation, so let me turn this the PowerPoint over to our first speaker, Michael Bruemmer. And Michael, you should have control of the PowerPoint. There you go.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, and thank you to consumeraction.org. I'm very delighted to be here. Linda, you did a great job with the introduction, so anytime you want to introduce me, I will take that all day long. I'm delighted to speak about synthetic ID fraud, how it's developed into a very serious threat, and how to protect your business as well as what to do from a consumer standpoint. I have to have a little bit of a spoiler alert because I do disagree, Linda, that the second question on how much is synthetic identity theft actually impacting the economy. The numbers I have say it's actually 79% higher to almost $56 billion annually. Either way, it's big. And it is the fastest growing form of all identity theft. Its most common origin is on the dark web, where stolen identity information can be bought and sold. And at the current rate of breaches this year, almost 4 billion pieces of new identity elements have been added in 2023. Simply put, synthetic identity theft is taking a valid social security number and using other mixed but valid identity elements together. So let me say that again. Synthetic ID theft is taking a valid social from someone, but combining with the address, the email, the phone number, the government ID from other people to create a whole new identity. And it evades detection since the components are real, but just don't belong together. So it can bypass many fraud resolution systems that are keying only off of a valid social. So how do you detect synthetic ID theft? What we found at Experian, the single best way is to have identity theft protection. It doesn't have to be a paid for product, it can be a free product, but it will alert you to changes in your credit file. You should also check regularly for new accounts, deleted accounts, and changes to any account information, whether it's your online shopping site of preference, whether it's your financial institutions, your insurance companies, but monitoring those financial institutions for new debit accounts, mortgages, investment account regularities, or even transactions that you don't recognize, those things are a sure sign that something may be going on. Also, unknown calls from people that aren't in your contact list, potentially new creditors that you don't recognize, suspicious email, and then sometimes you'll even notice that your internet service provider has multiple accounts in your name. These are just some of the signs, and you should be wary if any or all of these may be happening, because it probably means something is going on with your identity at that point in time. Now, if you're a business, what can you do to protect your organization from being scammed by someone who is using a synthetic ID? The trick is to validate across each element of the identity, not just the social security number. Many resources are available, like leveraging a network with a financial institution. An example of this is the FICO Falcon system to complete fraud checks. There's also other ID elements such as address confirmation, correct passport number, the IP address or device ID that goes along with that transaction. And financial institutions and other companies are able to provide you with these additional factors in addition to keying off of a valid social security number that will allow you to say, hey, this identity is suspicious. Also, I think you need to keep in touch with what's happening out there, and knowing that if some of these large batches of elements that may end up in the dark web are actually happening, and we're seeing right now a rash of third-party breaches over the past 12 months. These are companies like SolarWinds, Excelon, and most recently the MoveIt breach, where credentials are being stolen, they're being sent out on the dark web, and they may be used to set up that synthetic ID to evade the validation. Also, one last point, major breaches in both Oregon and Louisiana had both states' motor vehicle driver's license as well as some socials compromised just over the past 60 days. So it pays to pay attention, because you need to be on guard if more of these elements are out there. So as a consumer, how do you protect yourself? My best and number one advice is to either lock or freeze your credit report. A lock is convenient, but a freeze is able to be done over the phone without even having a membership. and all three credit bureaus are able to help you there. There's also free account and transaction monitoring from your financial institution. So look at who you bank with, set up an alert for either a new transaction, a new line of credit, a geographical transaction. So if something comes from the United States, that may be fine, but something coming from overseas. Also, for all of your major trade lines that you have with a particular financial institution, make sure that they are confirmed and validated in your account. Second, I would avoid calls and emails from people you do not know. It's very common nowadays when people will inherit someone else's phone number or email account, and even though you may think they are valid because they're in your contact list, if you're not expecting a phone call from somebody that you don't recognize, or even somebody you do recognize, it's okay just to decline the call, because even speaking to somebody for a short period of time, and I'm talking less than 10 seconds, they could also copy a voice print combined with other identity information and synthetic ID. They could get around the questions asked by a financial institution as a part of a two-factor authentication. Let me also turn to social media. Please stay away from posting any personal information on social media. It doesn't matter even if it's the location you're at on vacation, pictures of your kids, the name of your dog, any of that stuff is really a no-no. Finally, the last two things, the old-fashioned shredding of documents that have any personal information is a good thing. You may want to keep tax records and a few bills for, let's say, 60 days, but everything older than that and stuff that is outdated should be shredded and put in the bin. And last but not least, and I've said this a couple times during my earlier comments, be suspicious. If it seems odd, it probably is. And with identity theft, the sooner that you take action, the easier it is to either stop altogether or even unwind. So how does this ID theft begin? Identity theft really starts when you lose your identity information, you have it stolen, or it's just viewed and copied when you're not suspecting it. I've listed some specific examples on this chart. In 2022 alone, the average adult in the US received at least 5 notices. That may be a substitute notice from a website, it may be an email, it may be a physical letter that said you were impacted by a data breach. And whatever communication you receive that you've been a victim of a data breach, there are free resources that are offered. There may be paid for identity theft protection and steps that you should take in that notification letter to protect yourself. And it's very important that you act quickly. Remember, it only takes one mistake, whether you click on a link, whether you don't update your software on your computer, whether you, let's say, don't recognize a government benefit check that came to you by mistake and you're thinking, oh, hey, that's not a big deal. Maybe somebody that's has already set up a government benefit account in your name, but just got sloppy and left your address on it when they actually were expecting it to send it themselves. And remember, if you see anything with identity theft protection where it's monitoring the dark web, if any information is out in the dark web, that means identity theft has probably already become, and you should contact your identity theft protection provider or sign up for one of the free services that's offered. I know Eva is speaking after me from the ITRC, and they're also a really valuable resource for people that either suspect identity theft or have it going on. This is my last slide, and I'm going to close with some of the common scams to be aware of, in addition to some of the things that I just talked about in terms of how identity theft begins. And the basic premise here is that, especially if you're online, if the thing or the deal is too good to be true, it most likely is a scam. The number one scam going on right now is romance scams, especially with the boom in online dating and the fact that we're still remote. You actually can't validate by putting your eyes on or seeing somebody you're having to trust with just them with their picture and their electronic background information. And scams in the romance category so far in 2023 are up 500% versus last year. Disaster relief. This was one of our predictions, and we've done annual predictions about the threats coming each year. This was one of our 2022 predictions because 30% of all Americans give to charity, and there are so many fake charities that come up after the disasters that are happening. I looked online this morning, and some of you may have seen or live in the Northeast where the flooding's happening. In the top 3 or 4 sites to give to people that have been impacted by the flooding, 2 of those sites are fake sites. They're not actually going to disaster relief, but they're scams that are already set up in the first 24 hours of this event happening. Government benefits, another one. The Associated Press said last year for all of the COVID-19 relief funds that were sent out, there was over $280 billion worth of fraud. So these are people that are using potentially a synthetic ID to get government benefits, and in fact, they weren't due. Criminal events and utility shut off. The criminal arrest is you get a text from someone that says, hey, Mike Bruemmer, we've just got a warrant for your arrest. We're sending over the sheriff department to your house, but you can go ahead and pay with your credit card and they won't come and arrest you. It's something as simple as that. Or the family member that's you haven't heard from in a while, they're all of a sudden incarcerated in Mexico and been kidnapped, and people ask for you to send payment to have your family member released. And then the couple of my favorites are about 1 in 10 of the cash apps where you can get free cash, this might be a short-term loan, are actually fraud. And whether they're sold on a reputable site, they may not have been validated. And last but not least, it's the summer travel system. Don't use any free charging stations in any public places because they could be downloading information off of your phone that you're not aware of. At the same time, I would also put public Wi-Fi in that same category. Unless you have encryption on your phone itself, using public Wi-Fi is just not a good thing to risk your reputation and your identity on, because there are devices out there that if you connect up to, they can actually, through Wi-Fi, download information transmitted from your phone or even inside your phone. So I am at the close. I am going to turn it back to Linda because Charles is up next, but thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much for all of that great information, especially for that list of scams. We need to be reminded every month about the list of scams. Our next speaker is Charles Harwood. And okay, Charles, you have you're on. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thanks to the team at Consumer Action for hosting this program. And hello to everybody who's tuning in today. So I'm Charles Harwood, and I work for the Federal Trade Commission. The presentation you'll be seeing today is one that I'm solely responsible for, however. So please understand that these are my views and my views alone. So Linda, we should be on the FTC slide that says hello, which is where I started. So we'll start with that slide then. The FTC, as probably many people on this call know, is a national consumer protection agency. We enforce consumer protection antitrust laws. We educate consumers and businesses about those same laws. We amplify enforcement education through partnerships and coalitions such as those you're participating in today with Consumer Action and the other participants on this call. We have a lot of resources to empower people to spot fraud and report identity theft, including identitytheft.gov, which I'll be talking with you about in a few minutes. But first, let's look at what some of the reports tell us about identity theft in the United States on the next slide. And this slide should be titled Identity Theft in the United States. So this slide is actually the summary of a survey that was done by the U.S. Department of Justice in 2018, although they didn't publish the results until 2021. And what they found was that 23 million people in the U.S. experienced some form of identity theft, and we'll talk about what that means in just a minute, but some form of identity theft in 2018. So that's 1 out of every 9 people in the United States age 16 and up in 2018 experienced some form of identity theft. So let's go to the next slide and see a little bit more about what that means. And this should be titled 2022 FTC Identity Theft Reports. Now, the FTC receives many reports from consumers about identity theft. Indeed, in 2022, we received over 1 million reports from consumers about identity theft. To be precise, 1.107.209 million identity theft reports. And a majority of many of those reports concerned credit card fraud. Credit card fraud means a variety of things, but effectively we could think of it as meaning someone is using somebody else's credit card number to make purchases that are not that won't be paid for, and they're not in the name of the purchaser, and are in fact a result of fraudulent activities. We also saw a variety of complaints regarding identity theft in other areas. Government documents and benefits fraud. We've already heard about some of the problems in that area from Michael. It's been a big issue. Employment and tax-related fraud, again, a big issue over the past few years with people using fake information to obtain employment or unemployment benefits and things like that nature, particularly during COVID. We saw problems with bank fraud, and we saw a lot of problems with loan or lease fraud. So the lesson here is identity theft can take a variety of forms. And people see it in a variety of ways, including some of the ones shown in this pie chart. So let's go to the next slide, which is a map of the United States. So the point of this map is just to show you that identity theft it doesn't happen everywhere in the same percentage across the United States. So the darker states shown on here are the states where there's a higher per capita percentage of identity theft reported to the FTC. Per capita means reports per 100,000. So a darker colored state means that a higher number of people per 100,000 reported identity theft. Doesn't mean that if you happen to live in a state that's very light colored on this list, you will not be the target of identity theft. But what it does mean is that if you live in a state that is one of the darker colored ones, you particularly want to be on guard because you appear to be in a state where identity theft appears to be more common, sadly, and you want to be aware of that and be cautious about the risks posed to you by identity theft. So now let's go to the next slide, which is another pie chart, just like the one I just showed. So this is essentially just a chart showing what's happening in 2023 with identity theft. My previous chart was 2022. If you were to compare the two charts, you'd find that this chart is very similar to the last chart in the last pie chart. In 2023, the first 3 months, January through March, the FTC received 280,000 identity theft reports. If you extrapolate that out for the full 12 months of the year, you'd find that's a slightly larger number than we received in 2022. So it's maybe identity theft is up slightly, but on the whole, what we're seeing is identity theft continues to be a major problem for consumers. And we're seeing the main kinds of identity theft continue to be the same. Credit card fraud is commonly reported, loan and lease fraud, government documents fraud, bank fraud, a whole range of other kinds of fraud in which identity theft is involved. They're the ones that we're continuing to see. And so the problem persists. So now let's go to the next slide and actually zero in on the idea of synthetic identity theft. And Michael's already talked about this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But we'll just touch on it again because it's a key concept for this whole webinar today. So traditional identity theft, the kind that that we've all been hearing about for years now, it basically involves a criminal stealing and misusing a person's actual identity. What that means is that they have stolen enough information to essentially claim to be me, Charles Harwood, or claim to be somebody else. And they can use that information then to obtain benefits or to obtain other things that I might be entitled to. So that's how traditional identity fraud works. Synthetic identity theft, though, is different in that it's a crime in which perpetrators combine fictitious and sometimes real information, such as Social Security numbers, and Michael talked about that, along with names to create new identities to defraud financial institutions, government agencies, or individuals. Now, it can be used to apply for credit cards. It can be used to apply for loans. It can be used to apply for government benefits. All those things are possible. So what that tells us is that some of the reports that we saw in the previous few slides about, the percentage of identity theft, some of those were probably synthetic identity theft instances, and some of them were probably traditional identity theft instances. The truth is we don't really know, but we can be confident that sometimes when people call us and say somebody is using my Social Security number, we can suspect that may be a synthetic identity theft instance. Now, the way fraudsters work with these identity theft schemes, I'll explain that in just a second. So let's go to the next slide, which is titled Example. So in this slide, which is titled Example, you're looking at an instance that actually was a case that the U.S. Department of Justice brought in 2013. And it's an old case, but it's a good case to illustrate what happens with synthetic identity theft. So in 2013, the Department of Justice charged 18 people in one of what it called the biggest and most complex credit card fraud schemes ever. And remember, I said credit card fraud is one of the most common kinds of identity theft, but one of the biggest and most complex credit card fraud schemes ever. So here's what the DOJ found. This scheme had operated for 10 years. So, it goes back to the early 2000s. It spanned 28 states and 8 different countries. It created this group of 18 people created a network of 7,000 synthetic identities. So that's 7,000 fake people, fake identities, to fraudulently obtain more than 25,000 credit cards. It's a lot of credit cards. They created those synthetic identities by combining unissued Social Security numbers. So these weren't necessarily invalid. They just were ones that hadn't actually been issued yet, but they were valid and they could be issued in the future. Combining unissued Social Security numbers with fake personal information. They then used those Social Security numbers and fake personal information to obtain credit cards, typically with low spending limits initially because people scrutinize those less, the issuer scrutinized those less, and so they were easy to get. And then they increased the spending power over time by making small purchases and regular payments and building their credit, just like we tell everybody else to do. Here's how you build your credit up. Make your regular payments. Be consistent about your payments, watch your bills, those kinds of things. They did the same thing. They took these credit cards, they made small purchases, regular purchases, they made sure they made their payments. At the same time, they set up 80 sham companies. So these were made up companies and obtained credit card terminals that they could use to actually run charges through from these fraudulent credit cards. Once they got these credit cards up to a fairly high amount, high credit balance, high credit permissions, and they were viewed as being reliable credit cards. They then proceeded to run these credit cards through these fake terminals and charge to buy lots of products. So this crime ring generated huge profits. Its members spent lavishly on luxury goods, cars, electronics, and gold. They stockpiled large sums of cash, and they wired millions of dollars overseas to a global network of co-conspirators. By the time the fraud ring was uncovered, more than $200 million had been stolen by this one fraud ring alone. And actually, some industry experts speculate that the actual losses could have been closer to $1 billion. But because of the nature of the fraud and its complexity and the fact that it's synthetic identity theft can be hard to spot, we really will probably never know entirely. The case is now closed. This particular case is now closed. And most of the defendants, thankfully, pled guilty. They were prosecuted and pled guilty, faced a variety of charges, including bank fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, wire fraud, access fraud. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that while this case in 2013 has now been resolved, there are many, many more out there still operating today. And that, of course, is why we're all here today to talk about synthetic identity theft. So now let's go to the next slide, which looks at some industry estimates of identity theft, synthetic identity theft. So as Michael's already said, and I think Linda mentioned this too, if I'm not mistaken, it's been characterized as the fastest growing type of financial crime in the United States today. Now, beyond that, there are lots of different numbers you'll hear from people about the percentage of, about the cost of identity theft, particularly to industry. That's because it's hard to detect. It's hard to know when it's happening. It can be very subtle. It can take years to develop. There are various numbers, as I said. Here are just a few that I came up with. They won't necessarily agree with others you've heard, but understand that whichever numbers you select, they're large, and they mean what they really mean is a lot of companies are affected. So, for example, by one estimate, 20% of all credit losses in the United States in 2016 were attributable to synthetic identity theft. 20% of all credit losses. Somebody else in 2016 estimated that for the average charge-off per instance related to synthetic identity, so the average instance where somebody just said, we're never going to collect on this because of synthetic identity theft, there were $15,000 in losses for just that one charge-off, for an average charge-off. Another entity estimated that synthetic identity fraud or theft caused U.S. financial institutions to lose at least $20 billion in 2020. Now, the numbers may be much higher, as we've heard from Michael, but it's probably at least, and Linda's talked about $20 billion as well, and another estimate, it's probably at least $20 billion, sadly. So that's a huge loss, and it could well be higher, as we've heard. Then finally, nearly half of all businesses around the world have had to deal with synthetic identity theft. And in the United States, as many as 55% of businesses have reported that this happened to them. And truthfully, I would not be surprised if somebody told me the number is even higher than that, because it really requires instances where businesses are able to identify synthetic identity theft, and that can be hard to do. But at least 55% of businesses in the U.S. have reported being victims of synthetic identity theft. So now let's go to the next slide, which is titled Synthetic Identity Theft Consumers. So you may be thinking, this all sounds like a big bang problem. And after all, the person whose identity is being used to commit the fraud isn't a person at all in synthetic identity theft. It's just a collection of personal information, some fictitious, some stolen, that's combined to create an individual who only exists electronically, and no single person's identity is taken or misused. Well, I wish, yes and no. The problem, though, is that doesn't tell the whole story. Because even if financial losses are borne only by financial institutions, remember that when those financial institutions have to bear the losses, those costs must be passed on to the rest of us for those institutions to remain in business. So while they may be the initial receivers of the losses, and one way or another, they're going to have to pass them on. And you and I, as consumers, are going to end up paying for them. So we're paying for all that synthetic identity theft that we've been talking about today through increased fees and rates and other ways that banks frankly have to, and other financiers have to collect money in order to stay in business while also enduring this pandemic of synthetic identity theft. But it can also have other consequences in addition to financial losses. And by the way, there can also be individual financial losses, which we can talk about later, but they can also have other consequences. One of them is reputational harm from synthetic identity theft. So for instance, a criminal may misuse someone's social security number, combining it with maybe some made-up information or some partially made-up information. The criminal engages in other criminal activities. They may file for loans, or they may do something that results in wire fraud cases, or they may be arrested in a traffic stop or something like that, where somehow their social security number is picked up. If caught and prosecuted, that social security number couldn't be entered into a criminal database and flagged as a social security number associated with criminal activities. Police later run a background check, and guess what? The social security number comes up, but now it comes up in connection with the true owner of the social security number, the victim, if you will, who is now being suggested based on the report that the police have run that this person is a criminal, even though they didn't have any idea that somebody was using their social security number. And of course, it wasn't them. But because the criminal has used it already and has to engage in some financial or other illegal activity, the victim is now being accused of engaging in a crime because of that criminal activity. Now, of course, the other problem with that is that's the problem is that has a lot of bad, negative consequences if somebody suspects you're a criminal. Among them, frankly, it may mean it's harder to get a job if your name comes up in, and a lot of other things can happen as well. You may be facing arrest warrants, things of that nature. So you can think about all the ways that may happen. Now, I will also say that it can cause credit damage, and you see up here, that's my third bullet on this slide. What does that mean? Well, for example, if somebody were to suggest, if somebody were to run a credit report on you and they find that your credit report just doesn't quite match up, it's got weird anomalies in it, or maybe it's got charges that you can't explain, some large charges, that's going to result in more difficulty getting credit. And in fact, it can harm your credit score. So, fake accounts, even if it's not really you, but just a small piece of your information, if that information finds its way into a individual's credit report, it can have a significant negative consequences and harm their credit. So let's go to the next slide and talk about what consumers can do. So this is entitled Synthetic Identity Theft Consumers, and what can they do? Well, the first thing is to be vigilant, and in particular, guard your Social Security number. So not on the slide, but I'll give you a suggestion for that. If you have not checked the Social Security Administration and your Social Security number with the Social Security Administration, this is a good time to do it. You can do it easily by going to ssa.gov, that's socialsecurityadministration.gov, and look for the My Account link. You can set up an access account to access your Social Security number, which will show your earnings record, show a lot of other information about your Social Security number, including how much earnings are being reported year after year to your Social Security number. And guess what? If you happen to look at that and you see some strange or anomalous information, the kind of information that should put you on guard, you want to be on guard, because that means somebody else may be using that same Social Security number, and you want to follow up with Social Security Administration right away. But take a look at that information, set up an account. And by the way, the other reason to set up an account, make sure you use you'll see there's a lot of security features with that account, but make sure you take advantage of all of them. The other reason to set up is so somebody else can't set one up. But anyway, set up a Social Security number account so you can check your Social Security number. I'll talk about the other three items on this slide in just a minute, but they include monitoring your credit report, considering what we call a credit freeze or credit alert, and then what to do if you actually suspect you've been the victim of identity theft. So let's go to the next slide, which is entitled annualcreditreport.com. Now, it can be hard to identify synthetic identity theft when you're a victim. But as Michael's already said, there are some things you can look for if you look at your credit report. And they include, information that's not yours, anomalous information, things that don't quite fit when you look at your credit report, incorrect name or address that may be added to your credit report and just doesn't match. Accounts you don't recognize, unknown balances on your current account. You don't remember, somehow your Social Security number is showing that there's an account in your name, it's on your credit report, it's not a balance you recognize, it's not even an account you recognize. Or maybe even inquiries from companies that you've not contacted. So that's some of the things to watch for. Now, what do you do if you see those things? Well, first by reviewing your credit report, begin by contacting the credit reporting agencies. If you're not sure how to do that, there's an FTC website that'll help you through that, ftc.gov credit. And if you suspect identity theft, we'll talk about this in a minute, you can go to identitytheft.gov. Now, how do you get access to these credit reports? There are a number of them out there. There are at least three that you probably want to check from the three major credit reporting agencies, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. You can get one free from each of the three. And at the present time, you can still get one free from each of the three every single week. You can do that by going to annualcreditreport.com. That's a website operated by all three of the credit reporting agencies. It's an easy way to pull up your credit report and take a look at it. There are various ways, obviously there are other ways to do this too. You can either arrange for somebody else to do your credit monitoring. There are some great services out there that will do that for you if you don't have them do it. But if you just want to do it yourself and take a look yourself, start with annualcreditreport.com, pull up your credit report, and take a look at what it shows. You could do that right after this call if you want, or right after this webinar if you want to see what's showing up in your credit report. So now let's go on to the next slide where I talk about credit freezes and fraud alerts. And you'll hear both terms talked about. So I want to just mention a few things about each. So, and this is actually from the FCC's website. You can find this graphic on our website. But a fraud alert is something that you would put on your credit report if you suspect someone's already engaging in in identity theft using your information. What it does is, and you can do it by contacting one of the three major credit reporting agencies, credit bureaus, and that bureau will then notify the other two. It lasts a year. It's free. It's available to anyone who suspects they may be affected by identity theft. What it does is, it says that lenders who must take extra steps to verify that when somebody applies for credit using the information in front of them, particularly, for example, Social Security number, they must verify that it's actually that person. Now, that's what it does. Now, the problem may be that with synthetic identity theft, that may be challenging. In fact, if the synthetic identity thief has done a good job, they may well have created a situation where it may be difficult to distinguish whether the Social Security numbers who it's associated with, and it's possible consumers that it will actually come up as being associated with that person because of the way they've created the fake identity. But that's what a fraud alert will do, and it's still worth doing if you believe you've been the victim of identity theft, even synthetic identity theft. Now, what about credit freezes? Credit freeze is another term you'll use, and that's essentially a process where you can actually restrict access to your credit report. And what you usually do there is you contact each of the three credit reporting agencies separately, and these are free. And you let them know that you want to freeze your credit. It's available to anyone. It lasts until you lift it. So unlike fraud alerts, it lasts until you lift it. But the difference is it stays in place until you take additional steps to lift it, and which means you'll have to, if you decide to apply for something that involves checking your credit later, if you apply for a new credit card, for example, you'll have to make sure you unfreeze your credit report in order to do that. And you do that usually through a PIN number or something like that you'll be given. But what it does then, until you unfreeze it, it makes it difficult for someone to actually access your credit report. Now, is that going to be effective against synthetic identity theft, where we're seeing this made-up identities? It might be a little bit. It doesn't hurt to do it. And even if it's not going to work that much with a synthetic identity theft, it's still a good practice, particularly if you're someone who is, let's say, older, and we've heard that they're one of the primary victims of synthetic identity theft and aren't applying for a lot of credit these days. It might make sense to look into instituting credit freezes to all three of your credit reports, because even if it doesn't, and it will probably help a little bit with protecting you against synthetic identity theft, it will also do a great job of helping protect you against other forms of traditional identity theft where someone is simply using your real name, your real Social Security number, and applying for new credit. So that's when you might want to consider credit freeze. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to talk about the other thing, what to do if you think you've been the victim of some form of identity theft, whether synthetic or traditional. So on this slide, which is entitled identitytheft.gov, you will see this is about an FTC-operated website. And it's a website that it's essentially a one-stop shop that offers recovery plans for more than 30 types of identity theft, credit card fraud, other kinds of fraud. It's where you can turn if you believe you've been the victim. It helps you develop an individual recovery plan that streamlines what is admittedly a confusing process, the process of trying to recover from identity theft. It actually lays out for you a playbook of things you can do. It's a federal government operated website. It's hosted by the FTC, but other federal agencies also participate in it. It allows you to create an identity theft report, which you can then present to merchants to show that you've reported identity theft. It actually suggests ways you can write sample letters to alert credit bureaus, to alert others that you've been the victim of identity theft. It's important. It can actually be used to share with information with law enforcement agencies. Either you can share the report with them, or also they can get access to the actual report themselves. So it's really a useful tool for people who've been the victim of identity theft, because honestly, dealing with identity theft is a self-help type of situation. It's a situation where each victim has to take some steps. You can't just call 911 and expect a police officer. Indeed, it will probably do you no good. In fact, I would advise against calling 911, because they're not going to be able to help you at 911. This is not a 911 type situation. There's not a crime in progress that anyone is going to be able to go to a particular location and address. Instead, it's a situation where the crime is all about paper being passed and information being passed and misused. And that kind of crime involves a lot of work, and involves a lot of work on your part as well through self-help, such as reporting it to a variety of different agencies and organizations, creating and tracking where the information is being used, and doing steps like placing credit alerts and credit freezes on your credit report. So those are the things that identitytheft.gov can help you with. It's also available in Spanish, by the way. So let's go to the next, and I think these are down to the last two slides. This slide is entitled Spot Scams and Stay in Touch. So I've already talked about identity theft in the FTC's website. You can learn more about dealing with identity theft and other scams at consumer.ftc.gov. We also send out consumer alerts that talk about, for example, some of the kinds of frauds that Michael talked about earlier, which are common these days. And you can get those consumer alerts from the FTC at ftc.gov/consumer alerts. And finally, if you are someone who does presentations, or you have friends or neighbors who you might want to hear, who you want to talk to about identity theft, or indeed other consumer protection problems, you can order free materials from the FTC, hand them out at your church, or hand them out at school, things like that, and including, for example, an identity theft flyer booklet, which you'll see pictured in this slide. Also, something on child identity theft, which we'll be hearing more about in a minute. You can order this information at ftc.gov, bulk order. And final slide. So the FTC operates, as I've already said, a lot of identity theft resources and ways to help. But we also have a website for other kinds of fraud. Indeed, any kind of fraud, including many of the frauds that you heard Michael talk about, whether we're talking about telemarketing fraud, or whether we're talking about imposters, or whether we're talking about simply bad business practices. We actually have a new website that is a great portal to report that sort of thing. It's reportfraud.ftc.gov. It's also available in Spanish. You can report frauds, scams, and bad business practices. Report as anything you think might be a fraud, scam, or bad business practice. You can share as much or as little information to the FTC as you want. And anything a consumer will tell us is helpful to us. And it's also helpful to the many other law enforcement agencies. And right now there are about over 2,000 of them who have access to this information that we collect. So we would encourage you, if you believe you've been the victim of some kind of fraud or scam, go to reportfraud.ftc.gov and tell us about your experiences. Tell us what happened to you. It helps us at the FTC, and along with many other law enforcement agencies, track down and try to address this ongoing problem of fraud that we're all very aware of, but we can spend more time, and should be spending more time even than we do now, trying to address it. And if you're a victim of identity theft, check out identitytheft.gov, also from the FTC. And with that, I am done. Thank you to Consumer Action again for hosting us today. And at this point, I will turn you back to Linda.
Thank you, Charles. Let me turn the presentation now over to Eva. Eva, you should have control.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thank you everyone for being here. You've just received a good primer on synthetic identity theft, but I want to further connect the dots here and talk about a population we haven't talked about, and that's children. So how does synthetic identity theft affect children and families? So that's where we'll start the conversation, and then I'll give you a brief kind of history, a little primer on how we got here and what we're doing about it. And then of course, some action tips and some opportunities, free recovery resources, particularly for all of the consumer-based organizations that are listening today. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the ITRC was established in 1999. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're here to empower all stakeholders to minimize their risk and mitigate the impact of identity compromise and crime. Now, how do we meet that mission? There's a couple of ways we do it. We do provide direct one-on-one assistance from live advisors through our toll-free hotline, live chat, text-to-chat, email, really any way folks want to get in touch with us. We do a lot of education and training, much like what we're doing today on this webinar. And then we have 4 annual research publications that we publish on a quarterly basis: our data breach report, our consumer impact report, our trends in identity report, and our business impact report. And my slides don't want to advance. There we go. So for purposes of this conversation, I know we've talked a lot about identity theft. Let's go back. Identity theft and fraud, and we've used the terms interchangeably, and that's understandable because most of the statutes are written as identity theft. But for this conversation, I am going to be talking in these terms. Theft is the initial act of stealing someone's information or their PII without their knowledge or consent. Look, it's typically for fraud or other malicious activities. And when I'm talking about PII, it's things like your social security number, your date of birth, driver's license, passport number, financial information. And then the fraud is that the specific use of that stolen information. Again, it's usually for financial gain, and we've talked a lot about the misuse in the financial sector, and that certainly is one of the most common types, but it can also be used in the medical sector, in the government sector, even criminal justice sector. So credentials are provided during or after the commission of a crime, and that can be from moving violations to felonies. Boy, Linda, you may have to take over advancing my slides because it isn't working for me. Sorry about that, folks. So let's talk about what child identity fraud and how it's linked to synthetic identity fraud. It occurs when we're talking about all of this data, it can happen to kids too. So it's kids' personal information that's being used by another individual, and again, for personal gain. The perpetrators really run the gamut. It can be a family member, a family friend, or it can be a stranger. We hear from folks in our contact center who know who the perpetrator is. They know it was a family member, someone maybe who lives in the household, and then people who have no idea who it could be. So from our experience, one isn't significantly more common than the other. A social security number is almost always necessary, but it can include other non-sensitive data like a name and an address. Now, in order to use a child's social security number in the financial sector, that date of birth has to be changed to someone over the age of 18, and voila, you have a synthetic identity. Now, the PII that we're talking about that has to be compromised, it can be compromised through various means, and that does include data breaches, hacking, phishing, scams. Could be the stealing, like physical theft of personal documents. It can even be social engineering. Sometimes it just be someone who knows the child and has access to that information. And for older children, it could be self-compromise, maybe by posting something online or sharing it with the wrong person. And it can be compromised in many ways, but it can also be misused in many ways. And I go back to the types of identity misuse: financial, government. Kids can be victims of medical and criminal, but sometimes it's also to gain employment or false employment. And that last bullet point, that the social security number can be tainted prior to issuance. I have some examples later in the presentation that'll help to further explain this. Linda, can you advance? Thank you. I know all child ID fraud is synthetic ID fraud. That's a bold statement, and I'm going to walk it back just a little bit, but I wanted to get your attention. Within the financial sector, which is what we've been talking about, all child ID fraud is synthetic because, again, that date of birth has to be changed, and therefore that synthetic identity is created. Now, those first set of numbers, that's from Javelin Research. There, we talked about it's very hard to measure, so these are estimates. 1 million children victims of the actual identity misuse. 1.7 million are victims of identity compromise, that's the theft. And in case that number sounds unbelievable, here's a recent example that I just found this morning, and it's from the Move It breach. Maybe some of you have seen that in the news. Move It is a large file storage and file transfer software that was hacked by a Russian cyber gang, and it's used by many organizations. And this includes the Minnesota Department of Education. And that one incident had data belonging to 95,000 students. 95,000 students in the foster care system had their data dumped online. And that's just from one incident that I pulled out of the data breach reports that we publish today. And the chart at the bottom, this is data from the ITRC's contact center. And I talked about false employment, and it has really increased this year. You can see in 2022, it was 28% of all the child ID theft or ID fraud cases that we worked on. But this year to date, it's over half of our cases, and it's already surpassed in the first 6 months of 2023 what we saw last year. So this is a very concerning trend. Next slide, please. So why is children's data so valuable? Well, they have a clean slate. Children typically have a clean credit history and no financial activity, which is how it should be. There's a long runway. It can go undetected for years since kids aren't checking their own credit or financial history, and they simply don't, navigate the outside world the same way adults do. And there is limited monitoring because parents and legal guardians often they don't know that this is an issue, and they don't know to regularly monitor their child's information for signs of fraud. It's highly lucrative. The thieves can enrich themselves to the tune of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single identity. And we simply don't have enough resources to investigate every single case. And these investigations are highly complex. Boy, they take a long time. And even when the crime can be investigated and tracked back to an individual thief, if the perpetrator is outside the US in a country where we don't have extradition authority, they can't be brought to justice. And that can have a real chilling effect on law enforcement. And even when a domestic thief is caught and prosecuted and convicted, the sentences are often not enough to deter them both from doing it in the first place and from doing it again when they get out 18 months, 2 years, 3 years later. So for all of the reasons I've listed above, we just have insufficient deterrence. We've created an environment which makes the return on investment really in favor of the criminal actors. Next slide, please. Now, these are case studies taken right out of the ITRC call center. I talked about false employment, and I just want you to look at the ages of the kids that are involved. 3 months old, 6 years old, 13 years old. And, the 13-year-old, it was in 2 places across the country. And the big takeaway from this is that most of the parents are detecting this, discovering this identity crime when they have applied for government benefits, and they are then subsequently denied. So the real impact here is that we have folks with children who are trying to get their basic needs met, and they can't until they unwind this issue, which can often take weeks, if not months. And so they're going without that necessary benefit that they are eligible for because of an identity crime. And then these other types of crimes, I just pulled one of each, financial, criminal, and medical, so that I could illustrate that it does happen in these other sectors. And when I was talking about the tainted Social Security numbers, that first bullet point, this parent discovered that there was a bank account opened in 2018 using this Social Security number that wasn't issued until 2020. So unfortunately, some parents are finding out that the activity associated with their child's Social Security number is actually older than the child is. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering, how did all these things happen and how did we get here? So I'm going to give a really abbreviated history about that and what we're doing about it. Next slide, please. So the first data breach law in this country was passed in California in 2003. But in 2005, ChoicePoint was the first organization to issue a national data breach notification under that new law. And I don't think that's really not something that most people know unless you're a data breach geek. I bet Michael Bruemmer knew that, but other than that, most people don't realize that it was ChoicePoint. And I put Target in here because I feel like that was the first one that really gained national attention. A lot of people all of a sudden started paying attention to data breaches because, wow, Target, a trusted national brand, not just for geeks. Everyone knows Target. It was near the holidays. People were doing holiday shopping. And so it really did catch national attention. Now, fast forward to today, we hit an all-time high for data breaches in 2021. There were 1,862 in a single year. Last year in 2022, we didn't quite hit that record number. We fell short of it by about 60 breaches. To date, there have been a little over 16,000 data breaches in the US since ITRC started capturing them back in 2005. And this year, we are going to exceed 2021 numbers, almost guaranteed. We've had more breaches just in the first half of this year than we had in all of 2016. And I wouldn't be surprised if we exceed the record set in 2021 before the end of the third quarter this year. And the reason this is important is because this is really what's fueling identity misuse. Now, breaches aren't the only way our data is compromised, but I can't downplay the impact that data breaches are having on this epidemic. Next slide, please. Now, here's some things that we've done about it in the past and some of the things that we're still working on. In 2011, the SSA implemented randomization. Now, it used to be that when you looked at a Social Security number issued before 2011, you could glean where and when that number was issued based on the number. You could tell within a time frame like what year or couple of years it was issued and what region it came out of. And randomization was supposed to thwart the thieves, and we definitely had good intentions. By taking a data point away from the thieves of knowing what the next series of numbers would be that would be issued, in a certain year or in a certain region. However, the unintended consequence was that we also took that data point away from the financial institutions. They were using it too as part of their determination of the legitimacy of a particular Social Security number. So this act really did help synthetic identities to further proliferate. And then in 2018, one of the things, this is good news, previously credit freezes, they either cost money or they were free depending on a patchwork of state laws, in particular for kids. It was free in some states, discounted, sometimes it was free for seniors. But in 2018, a federal law was enacted that required freezes to be free to everyone, including children. And then in 2020, the ECBSV was built through a public-private partnership effort, and that's the electronic consent-based verification system. And the reason I bring this up is when I talk to parents whose kids have been victimized, they always ask me, how did this happen? I thought that the Social Security Administration and the financial services industry, I thought they were communicating with each other. And the reality is they aren't, at least not at the scope and scale that needs to be done. There has always been an analog process, I shouldn't say always, but previously, an analog process existed that for this consent-based system, but it couldn't keep up with the pace. And now this is built, the ECBSV is built, and we hope once it's implemented and used more widely, that it's going to significantly reduce child identity theft in the financial sector. And I do have to make that clear. This only addresses the issue in the financial sector. Hopefully we can adopt this more broadly and it'll help with government and the medical sector and even the criminal sector. Next slide, please. So what are we doing moving forward? This proposal, the pandemic anti-fraud proposal, was released in March of this year, and it outlines steps that we can and should take to reduce the incident rate and assist victims. Now, the focus is primarily on pandemic-related fraud and within government systems. But the good news here for victims is that there's an appetite to acknowledge the harm caused by this crime and the resources needed to address it. And while, it really depends on how you're looking at this, through what lens. 600 million in investigations and prosecutions and prevention, and 400 million to help victims. That may sound like staggering dollar amounts, but when you look at the number, the tens of millions of individuals who are affected every year and the hundreds of billions that are lost, it really isn't out of place. And frankly, it should be more, but it's a very good start. Okay, next slide, please. So what can you do about it? Some of these are duplicates that you've heard earlier from the other two speakers, but it doesn't hurt to keep reiterating this. Freeze your credit. It's free. You can do it for your kids too. It doesn't take that long. Really, it's not an arduous process. Safeguarding your physical documents. Sharing your credentials judiciously. I do think this is an important reminder, especially for parents and guardians, because oftentimes when you're enrolling kids in programs or you're asked for their identifying information, you feel like you have to provide it. And that is not necessarily the case. You can ask questions. Ask, why do you need this? And can I decline? Yes, for government benefits, you absolutely do have to provide their identity credentials, but if a little league coach is asking for these credentials so your kid can play sports ball, I would ask a lot of questions and I definitely wouldn't share it. And then practicing privacy awareness and good cyber hygiene, that's something that parents can do for themselves and keep it top of mind. And then, kids model what they see. So when I say use age appropriate teachable moments, sometimes it's just talking about what you're doing. You get a phone call and it's a number you don't recognize. And you tell your kid, oh, I don't answer those. That's not a good idea. You're working on emails and you get some phishing emails and you're like, nope, not today, fraudster. And just mentioning that to your kids as they get older, really introducing them to this concept early on. Because I tell you, as a mother of 3 who are all grown, and now live all across the country, it goes in the blink of an eye. So I don't think it's ever too early to start. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I really want to share this opportunity. The ITRC has received a grant from the Department of Justice, Office of Victims of Crime, to provide free referral services. And that's through our help center, our live advisor staffed hotline, but also through our web-based help center to provide training and education. You can even have our live chat embedded on your website so that we can help the victims. And we're doing this for nonprofits, for government agencies, for law enforcement agencies, community-based organizations. And we're working with folks all across the country. The New Mexico AG's office has our live chat embedded, the San Diego District Attorney's office, the National Consumers League, fraud.org. So it's a really great opportunity to let you focus on what you do best, whatever help you're providing to the public. And when you encounter folks who are victims of an identity crime, you can send them to us for those victim services, and it's completely free of cost. Again, it's being covered by that grant. And the last tool I'll talk about, because I really want to bring awareness, breach awareness to the public, the ITRC has developed a tool, Breach Alert for Consumers, where you can go in and check our database to see if companies that you have a relationship with or do business with, if they've had a breach. And then if they haven't, and you want to make sure you stay on top of it, you can enter 5 companies into the database that you want to receive alerts on. So if at any future time we enter that company into our database, you'll get an alert. Now, we can't tell you if you've actually been a victim of that particular breach. That's information that only the company has, but we can at least bring it to your attention so that you can do some further digging and find out what's going on, because you know what, we're all busy and sometimes it's hard to keep track of this stuff, so we want to make it easy for you. And with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it back over to Linda, because I know we have a Q&A.
Eva, thank you so much for all of that great information. Special thanks to all of our guest speakers. Audience, now it's time to hear from you. So you get those questions to Nelson. Nelson, are you ready to go forward with questions?
Yes, we do have a lot of questions. We'll start with, we've learned so much today. One timely topic that we hear a lot about now is artificial intelligence. And somebody is asking, is there a concern around artificial intelligence making fraud easier, making this type of fraud easier in any way?
You want to direct that at any one of us?
No, you should, whoever wants to answer, and please go ahead and add on to each other's
I,
answers if you have more to add.
yeah, I won't speak for my other two panelists here, but I think we all agree, yeah, there's a huge concern. It does feel like it's a huge gift to the fraudsters. And while there are a lot of benefits, and I never want people to be afraid of technology and learning more about it, we do have to acknowledge that the speed at which this this technology works, particularly the voice cloning, the AI enabled voice cloning that can clone a voice with only 3 seconds of audio. I think that's Valley, Microsoft's Valley. I don't know
Hmm.
that that's been released yet. I don't think it's been publicly released, but when you think of the capacity, it's very concerning because as these tools make the ability to do these things cheaper and more accessible, well, then of course they're going to be exploited by the thieves. I mean, that's just how technology works. So we have to be aware of that.
And I'm happy to go next and let Charles bring it to a close. But we have done predictions for the last 10 years, and we decided to do a prediction instead of for 1 year, for 10 years out. And that prediction for FY23 was that the hackers would continue to stay further ahead than the people protecting your data. And it's because of AR, IR, whether it's chat GPT, and then also because of quantum computing. And the hackers are sophisticated enough that they're taking the leading edge of technology and using it against the people defending it. So I wholly agree with Eva's comments. And Charles, if you've got any other, please.
I'll just add one additional thing. The chair of the FTC, Lena Khan, recently characterized AI as having the potential to supercharge fraud. Those were essentially exactly her words. So I think it's a real concern. It has the benefit also that may help us identify fraud patterns and schemes, but at the same time, it can also be a valuable tool for fraudsters.
Thanks so much. And we heard about children's identity theft and other resources. Are there any specific resources for teens to take this more seriously, since we didn't hear that, they could be at higher risk if they give out information? Are there good places for them to learn, or what are some good resources for teens?
Well, of course, there's us, because all of the information that we have is applicable to children of all ages, anyone under the age of 18. But I would encourage parents to look for resources at their local PTA. And I know the national PTA has some great cyber hygiene and conversation starters for parents so that they can engage in the conversation, sign a contract with their older kids about how they're going to use technology and what the rules are, and just helping to make them more aware. And I'm sure Charles and Michael probably can think of some other ones.
Sure. I agree. And I think Eva, as a parent of 3, and I'm a parent of 4, I love the idea of signing a contract with your kids. And my kids now, 20 and 30 something, pass back some of the tips that I've been giving them for 5 or 10 years about, hey, no, Dad, I'm not doing this because you told me to watch out for this, and I've got a shredder or things like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, you really were listening. But I think it's really important. There are 2 resources I'll mention. One is Ask Experian blogs. If you put that in your browser, there's a wealth of information, both children, teens, and adults. And then also at www.experian.com/data breach. It has many of the same resources as well as additional thoughts for businesses as well as consumers.
Yeah, I mean, this is Charles Harwood. I'll just add that financial literacy and training is a critical process at every age level. I've been involved for a number of years with a group that provides financial literacy training for college students who are oftentimes dealing with loans and things of that nature, and are also targeted by a variety of scams, including identity theft. And it's certainly not, they're not kids, but they're still in need of financial literacy training. And certainly it's equally valuable, not more valuable, when you're dealing with high school students, middle school students, and even younger in some cases.
Yeah, there's one more thing I want to add, especially this time of year, because rising seniors are making college applications. One of the scams that's going on now that we have the Common App application where you can use that as the basis for applying to multiple schools, be careful of the sites that you pull that down from, because there's also scams that it will take the information that's input for that Common App and use it against you. So just a heads up on that.
Thank you, Michael. And then any tip, does any of you have any tips for someone to resolve after they're a victim? In this case, they are mentioning the common scam of getting a call from a fake number, looks like your bank, you click on something. In this case, they're describing a case where somebody clicked on a link and then $10,000 got drained from their business account, and now they're having a hard time with the bank trying to prove fraud. Any suggestions or tips on how to make your case as a victim of this type of fraud?
Well, as the organization with the free victim advocacy, I'll jump in first. And look, these cases, it's very hard to give sort of a blanket, if this happens, do this, because the cases are so unique, and that's why the ITRC exists. So I'm going to encourage this person to please reach out and get help. If you contact the ITRC at our toll-free number, get help from the FTC, get help from Experian. I mean, I think the overarching message here, rather than try to dissect this in the few minutes we have left, is there is no shame or embarrassment in needing help with these super complex issues. And so I always want to encourage people, I don't care if you clicked on a link or accidentally shared information when you thought it was someone else. That happens. We're all vulnerable given the right set of circumstances, and that includes me. I could absolutely be lied to and, think that I'm talking with somebody else or that an email is legitimate. We're all vulnerable. Don't be embarrassed. Get the one-on-one help that you need.
Well said, Eva.
Thank you, Eva. I'll move on to the next question, and I'll just read it. Medical providers now outsource their intakes to private companies that compile our personal information and private medical information. How secure is our data when these companies open and close, providers change contractors over time, and companies are acquired by others, for example, Amazon potentially acquiring One Medical?
I'm happy to take that. First of all, when you're going ahead and getting medical services, you don't have to provide your social to get medical services. It's not required. The reason why a lot of providers and chains and hospitals ask you to do it is for recovery if you don't pay your bill, and it's another way to track you down. But the least amount of information, first of all, should be given when you're going in for medical services, only the minimal amount. But as Eva and Charles and I all talked about, there's a rash of third-party companies that aren't the primary company you're doing business with, but they may be doing billing, they may be doing accounting, they may have secure file transfer software that company's using. So you really don't know when you sign in for services, not necessarily just medical, but any business, what their third-party providers are doing. So my advice would be always be judicious with giving out any personal identity information, especially unique identifiers, tax identification, social security number, passport number, because they don't need it.
Oh, great, thank you. We have another question on what can undocumented parents of US born children do to try to protect their kids from identity theft. They're already reluctant, of course, in many cases to engage with authorities, etc. Are there any tips? And also, kind of a related question, for a credit freeze, for example, is the social security number required? Is it based on the social, or can a TIN number be used? What are some thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just talk about the resources, and then I'll let Michael answer the question about the specific credentials needed for a credit freeze. But look, all of the resources that I talked about are certainly available to undocumented parents. I understand the reluctance to engage with law enforcement or government agencies, but there are nonprofits like the ITRC. You can contact us. We don't care. And there are a lot of organizations that simply want to help, and that's just a non-issue. However, I think people understand that these folks do want to proceed with caution. So I would do your homework about who you engage with, but also realize that there are plenty of organizations out there that can help those parents to protect their kids, because they deserve it.
Yeah, and we can accommodate. Generally, a credit freeze and your credit file will key off of a social security number, but a tax identification number, or if you're undocumented, we can work around that if you do have a file that needs to be frozen.
Okay, great, thank you. And then a couple of people wanted to ask Chuck, how is it that unissued social security numbers get used? Did you have any more information on that?
The unissued. I think there are. I don't have specific details. I can speculate. I think that there are two possible scenarios, and Michael and Eva may have more thoughts on this. One is that I think some of it was happening before, when the numbers under the old system, where the numbers were, where you could actually tell sequentially which number was going to be issued next, and so that was where it was happening in some instances. I also understand there are ways to identify which numbers could be issued and which numbers could be valid, and that's true as well now. And I gather what they were doing was they were identifying numbers that would pass the test for validity, but didn't necessarily appear to be associated with anyone in particular. But maybe Michael, give us a sense of how easy it is to create a credible unissued Social Security number.
Well, I think we have thieves that. Oh, sorry, Michael. Just real quickly, I think we have thieves that run at various levels of sophistication. So, of course, they're the ones that will go to the trouble to create these. They just make them up. Okay, they just make up the numbers. And some of them are going to make it up and throw it against the wall and see if it sticks. And the ones that get through, great. That's the ones that the identities, synthetic identities, they cultivate. And then to your point, Chuck, the more sophisticated groups will do things like run the numbers they've made up against maybe the Death Master Index and maybe run it against valid adult numbers that they know have been already issued and are already in use. So there's varying degrees, I think.
Eva's right. I was just going to mention the programs and the sophistication with quantum computing and what they're able to do, and try that. Again, Death Master file, for those of you that don't know what that is, that's the file that if you're deceased, you immediately should report the person's social security number to the IRS Social Security Administration to make sure that that is documented that way. But there a lot of different angles, and with the use of advanced technology, it makes it not only much easier but also much quicker to get it done.
Great, thank you. And I know we're running over time, but I was hoping to squeeze in a couple more questions if we can, especially since people will be able to watch the rest of this tomorrow. There's some concern here about, police reports sometimes are still required. Does the identitytheft.gov report satisfy that? Or what happens if a local police still doesn't want to take a report? I can't believe it's still happening, somebody's saying here.
Oh, We hear it all the
Eva,
time.
go ahead, Eva. You want to talk about
Yeah.
that first? Yeah, you know about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Go ahead, Eva.
our experience with victims and with the entities that have to be contacted in order to recover is some will accept the FTC affidavit in lieu of a police report, and that's great. Do that. For the ones that won't, we will often advocate on behalf of victims. We will let them know what the statute is in their state that requires that police take the report, and we'll help walk them through the process. It's essentially issuing a demand that the department take the report and why. And while we've talked to many, many people that run into this roadblock, I agree. I can't believe it's still happening today. These laws have been in place for decades. Sometimes it's that whole squeaky wheel gets the oil. We just tell them to be persistent, point out to law enforcement what the requirement is and why it's needed, and that will usually result in success. I wish it wasn't such an arduous process, but until we get some changes, either more places accepting that FTC affidavit or more resources for law enforcement to be able to, or even more of an automated system for some of these departments, I think we're going to have to handle these as a one-off department by department.
Well said.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Other than I'll just note that the affidavit that Eva is referring to is the one that's issued after a consumer fills out goes to the FTC Identity Theft.gov website and fills out their information, then they can generate the affidavit.
And what about an old school scam like somebody stealing checks from the mailbox?
Oh,
And
no.
you don't even know who they are.
It's
and
come
nobody-
back. It has come back. Check washing right now, just like Catch Me If You Can and Leonardo DiCaprio is actually making a comeback. Unfortunately, because now a lot of people with technology, they've gone retro and said, I'm not going to file for automatic payments or online processing. They're going to write the check, which just opened the door again.
Well, and we do some work with David Mayman at Georgia State University, and that his whole sole purpose in life is calling attention to the fact that there is so much stolen mail. And we used to advise people, if you're sending something sensitive, make sure you put it in the blue box. Don't put it in your on your mailbox for pickup by your mail carrier. And now even the blue boxes, I'm sorry to tell you, they are not secure. The keys to those boxes are floating around due to insider theft, employees at the post office either selling them or not relinquishing them when they leave employment. And there's even rings were stealing the keys from mail carriers at gunpoint. So it's not even stealing, it's robbery. And so at this point, those boxes aren't secure, and we encourage people to please, if you are sending anything through the mail, please take it actually to the post office and make sure it gets into the back room. And if you are expecting something coming to you in the mail, please keep an eye out for it and be very vigilant if it's not received within the time frame that it's expected, because mail theft is so rampant right now. And you're right, Michael, I cannot believe that we are seeing such a resurgence of check washing. It just felt like that was done. It's old school, but it's not. It is coming roaring back.
Great, thank you. And then we've gone over time, so I'm just going to ask one last question. If we didn't get to your question, please email it to us, and we'll try to forward it to our speakers and try to get you answers. Just going back to basics, getting that credit report. A couple of people talked about some problems. Somebody said when you're apparently the security questions have been reset at annualcreditreport.com, and they've been unable to get their credit report. Another person they thought they might have been at a fake site or something along those lines, and thought, is there a safer way to do this? I usually suggest that there's still the paper form. I don't know if you have other ideas, but there is a paper form for requesting the report as well, right?
Yes, you can request it. You have to get a form, as far as I know. And again, annualcreditreport.com is sponsored by Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. But if you run into a problem, I know Eva will say one of the people in the contact center at the ITRC can help somebody walk through it. Or if you reach out to me, we can help. There's no charge for it. We'll be able to help you get your credit report. So happy to be of assistance.
Great, thank you so much. If any of the speakers have any links that they'd like me to send overnight to our guests, I mean, our participants, we can get out additional links and resources. And I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you so much to the panel for helping us today.
Thank you, Nelson, and thanks to our guest speaker for hanging in there and answering those questions. Again, we want to thank our sponsor. This webinar was presented with funds from Experian. If you would like to contribute to Consumer Action, you can do so online by credit card or PayPal by going to www.consumer-action.org/giving, or you can mail us a check to Consumer Action Attention Membership Giving, 57 Post Street, Suite 611. Got to get that suite number right. San Francisco, California, 94104. Don't have a check? No worries. You can still support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. It's free, and it would help us continue to bring you these great webinars. We are trying to get 50 new subscribers today. So please help us reach our goal by subscribing today. Speaking of great webinars, please check your inbox for notification of upcoming webinars. Soon we will have a link on our website that will help you stay on top of our webinars and event, and you will be able to register for our webinars online, so stay tuned. Again, a very special thanks to our guest speakers for those excellent presentations. I can't wait to hear what you think about today's webinar, so please remember to complete that survey. We value your feedback as we strive to bring you timely, relevant information that will make a difference in the lives of the consumers you serve. This is all we have for you today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for submitting those questions and keeping the conversation going. Remember, a link to today's recording will be released tomorrow. And also, if you are waiting for those CEUs, you will get the password for that tomorrow. So watch your inbox. Hope to see you again soon. A special thanks to Michael, Chuck, and Eva for those great presentations. Thank you so much. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Linda.